If you spend enough time around commercial water systems, you learn that water has memory, not in a supernatural way, but in a structural one. If a pipe leaks behind a drywall panel in 1994, the timber behind it will always retain a slight warp, a faint damp musk that never truly dries out, no matter how many industrial fans you run. My name is Marcus. I'm a certified boiler technician and commercial pump operator. In the fall of 2021, I took a contract with the county to oversee the seasonal decommissioning of the Grandview Recreational Center. Grandview was a massive, brewless concrete structure built in the late 1970s. It housed 3 Olympic-sized indoor pools, a sprawling network of communal locker rooms, and an underground mechanical basement that resembled the engine room of a mid-century battleship. The county had built a shiny new glass facility across town. The Grandview was scheduled for complete demolition the following spring. My job was simple: drain the main tanks, flush the chemical lines with neutralizer, and shut down the high-pressure steam boilers so the building could sit through the winter without pipes freezing and bursting. The county gave me a master key ring, a stack of pressure logs, and a small office in the dry hallway behind the spectator bleachers. Because the facility was completely closed to the public, I chose the 4 p.m. to midnight shift. I like the quiet. In my line of work, you diagnose problems with your ears before you ever use a wrench. You listen for the rhythmic cavitation of failing impeller, a high-pitched whistle of a loose pressure flange, or the hollow thud of water hammer in the deep lines. For the first 3 weeks, the job was entirely routine. The main lap pool took 4 days to drain completely, leaving a vast, echoing chasm of green-veined white tile that smelled strongly of old chlorine and smooth river silt. By the 4th week, I had moved down to the lowest level, sub-basement 3. This was the pump room, situated directly beneath the deep end of the diving well. It was a subterranean cavern of raw, unpainted concrete, illuminated by wire-caged yellow utility bulbs that hummed faintly in the damp air. The floor was crisscrossed by massive iron intake pipes, 3 feet in diameter, painted dull blue and held to the ceiling by heavy steel joists. On Thursday night around 9 o'clock, I was adjusting the pressure seals on pump line C when I felt the floor beneath my boots vibrate. It wasn't a sudden shudder like an earthquake. It was a slow, rhythmic pulsing. I stopped my wrench and placed my palm flat against the cold concrete floor. The vibration was coming from the overflow cistern, a massive enclosed concrete holding tank buried beneath the foundation floor. The cistern was designed to catch the heavy surge water from the pools above, filter it, and pump it back into the system. According to the blueprints, that cistern had been completely drained and isolated 10 days prior. It should have been bone dry. I walked over to the cistern inspection manhole, a heavy circular iron plate secured by 6 massive zinc bolts. I knelt down and pressed my ear against the metal. From deep within the dark, sealed vault beneath the floor, I heard the sound of water. It wasn't the rushing, turbulent sound of a new leak. It was the slow, rhythmic sloshing of a vast body of water moving back and forth, hitting the concrete walls with a heavy, wet slap. But what made me frown was the tempo. Water doesn't slosh in an enclosed tank without an external force moving it. It requires displacement. It sounded exactly as if someone was standing in the center of the dark cistern, slowly wading through 3 feet of heavy, stagnant water, taking one deliberate step every 4 seconds. I stood up, wiping the damp rust from my palm onto my coveralls. I walked back to my office on the main floor to check the manual level logs. The building was dead silent as I walked through the dark, echoing hallways. The empty pools upstairs acted like giant amplifiers, catching the distant sound of wind outside and turning it into a low, hollow moan that echoed through the ventilation ducts. I pulled the master logbook from my desk and flipped back to November 14th. There it was, in my own handwriting. Cistern isolated. Discharge valve 1 through 4 locked open. Tank volume 0%. The valve must have failed, I muttered to myself. If one of the main storm drain valves on the exterior of the building had seized or cracked, water from the autumn rains could be backing into the cistern from the city main. If the tank filled up too high, it would eventually flood the sub-basement pump room, ruining tens of thousands of dollars of electrical panels, that the county still needed to salvage. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench, my headlamp, and a manual ultrasonic depth gauge. I hurried back down the concrete stairs to sub-basement 3. When I stepped into the pump room, the air felt significantly colder than it had 10 minutes ago. A thick, heavy humidity had settled into the room, causing the cold iron pipes to sweat, their surface slick with rows of oily condensation drops. I walked over to the manual level indicator, a vertical glass tube mounted on the side of the concrete cistern wall. A small bright orange plastic float inside the tube was supposed to show the water level. The glass tube was completely empty. The orange float sat dead at the bottom of the gauge, 0 feet. But as I watched the glass, a tiny bubble of air rose to the bottom of the tube. Then the water inside the gauge suddenly surged upward. The orange float rocketed up to the top of the tube, 12 feet, before violently dropping back down to the bottom with a sharp glass clack. The heavy, wet sound from inside the concrete wall answered the movement of the gauge. It was closer now, right against the inner face of the concrete where I was standing. I set my ultrasonic gauge flat against the concrete structure. The digital screen flickered, the red numbers jumping erratically. 3.2 feet, 8.7 feet, 0 feet, 11.4 feet. The machine couldn't get a solid reading because the water inside wasn't level. It was churning. Something was creating a massive localized wake inside the sealed concrete box that had no electrical power, no running pumps, and no open vents. Then the high-pressure intercom unit mounted to the pump room wall let out a sharp electronic squeal. This intercom was part of an archaic hardwired system that connected the pump room directly to the lifeguard stations on the pool deck upstairs. It hadn't been used in a decade. The plastic housing was yellowed and covered with a thick layer of dust. The speaker didn't broadcast a voice. It broadcasted a sound. It was the distinct, hollow sound of someone breathing through a snorkel. The air drawing through the long tube with a dry plastic rattle, followed by the wet, gurgling sound of water clearing the valve. I backed away from the intercom. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Who's up there?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the concrete columns. No answer, just the steady, rhythmic gurgle from the speaker, perfectly synchronized with the heavy slosh of water behind the wall. I couldn't stay in the basement. The feeling of being beneath thousands of gallons of invisible moving weight was making my breath short. I turned and ran up the stairs. My heavy work boots clattered against the metal risers until I burst through the double doors onto the main pool deck. The facility was dark, save for the pale green of security lights mounted high on the brutalist ceiling. The empty Olympic lap pool looked like a massive concrete quarry in the dim light. I walked along the edge of the deck, my eyes fixed on the far end of the room, the diving well. The diving well was a separate square pool, 15 feet deep, featuring a towering concrete diving platform that cast a long, geometric shadow across the floor. According to my schedule, the diving well had been drained 3 days ago. But as I approached the edge, my headlamp beam caught a dark, shimmering reflection. The diving well wasn't empty. It was filled to the absolute brim with water. But it wasn't the clear, blue chlorinated water of a functioning public pool. It was completely black, thick and perfectly still. The surface was like a sheet of dark glass, reflecting the concrete rafters above with terrifying clarity. I stopped 2 feet from the edge, my flashlight beam cutting into the dark water. The light didn't penetrate more than a few inches. The liquid was dense, carrying a faint mineral smell like river mud and rotting leaves. As I stared down into the blackness, I noticed a tiny ripple from the exact center of the pool. A single bubble of air rose to the surface and popped with a faint snip. Then another, then a dozen more. Deep beneath the surface, at the very bottom of the 15-foot well, a pale light was shining. It was a weak, greenish glow moving slowly across the floor tiles. It looked exactly like a diver's underwater flashlight, its beam sweeping from left to right as someone was searching the bottom for a dropped pair of keys. "Marcus." The voice didn't come from behind me. It came from the water. It didn't sound like human throat speaking in the open air. It was muffled, vibrating resonance of voice traveling through liquid. The words heavy, distorted and slow, rising up through 15 feet of black water before breaking the surface. "Marcus, check the intake." I stumbled backward, my foot heel catching on the lane line anchor. I hit the tiled floor hard, dropping my flashlight. It rolled away, its beams spinning across the ceiling before settling on the base of a high dive platform. From the center of the dark pool, the water began to lift. A heavy, perfectly circular swell rose 2 inches above the deck line, pouring a silent, smooth sheet of black liquid over the white tiles. The water didn't rush towards me. It crept along the grouted seams of the tile, moving like cold oil, spreading out in a perfect, expanding ring around the diving well. I scrambled to my feet, leaving the flashlight on the floor, and sprinted back towards the main exit doors. I didn't care about the logs, the boilers, or my contract. I wanted to see the streetlights of the main road. I threw my weight against the heavy panic bar doors that led to the front parking lot. The metal bar depressed with a loud clunk, but the doors didn't open. They didn't budge an inch. I peered through the narrow wire glass window on the door. My old truck was sitting right there under the park lot lights, not 50 feet away, but pressed hard against the outside glass pane was water. The entire front lobby of the other side of the glass was completely submerged. I could see the plastic lobby chairs and old signboards floating aimlessly in a green, murky twilight. The water was pressed against the exterior glass with immense force, the thick panes groaning under a static head of pressure that was slowly spiderwebbing the corners of the frame. The building wasn't draining out into the city's sewer. The city's sewer was draining into the building, filling the walls, the lobbies, and the deep shafts from the outside in. The hardwire intercom speaker above the exit doors clicked on. Volume capacity reached. The flat metallic voice from the basement returned, but now it was punctuated by the same wet, snorkeled breath. Valves locked open. Then the main ceiling lights across the entire facility died. The building was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the weak, greenish glow bleeding through the pool deck doors behind me. The sound of water was everywhere. Now it was cascading down the concrete bleachers, rushing through the electrical conduits, and bubbling up from the floor drains beneath my feet with a steady rising hiss. I turned around, my back pressed against the locked exit doors, staring down the long, pitch-black hallway. At the far end of the corridor, where the doors of the pool deck sat, a shape emerged through the gloom. It wasn't a monster. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a vintage canvas commercial diving suit with a heavy circular copper helmet. The glass faceplate of the helmet was illuminated from the inside by the same sickly green light I had seen at the bottom of the diving well. He wasn't running. He couldn't. The suit must have weighed 200 pounds. He walked with a heavy, leaden stride, his iron-shod boots making a dull, wet clank against the concrete floor. As he walked, a thick trail of black, muddy river water spilled from the seams of his canvas sleeves, pooling around his boots and rushing ahead of him down the corridor towards me. Through the copper grill of his helmet, the voice spoke one final time. It wasn't loud, but the vibration of it shook the marrow of my bones. "The log is closed, Marcus. The pool is full." The glass pane in the exit door behind my head gave way with a deafening, explosive crack. A wall of freezing, stagnant water burst through the frame, hitting my shoulders like a concrete block, lifting me off my feet and dragging me backward into the dark, roaring current of the flooded hallway. I didn't drown. I woke up at 5:30 the next morning, lying in wet gravel of the retention pond behind the recreation center. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was pale, clean gray. My clothes were soaked through, caked in green pond weeds and smooth black silt, and my lungs burned with every breath as if I swallowed a gallon of pool chemicals. The Grandview Recreation Center sat 50 yards away, perfectly still and dry under the morning sky. I dragged myself up and walked around to the front parking lot. My truck was sitting exactly where I left it. The front lobby windows were completely clear. The plastic chairs were sitting neatly on the dry linoleum inside. There was no water. There were no broken panes. I let myself in with my master key, my limbs trembling from the cold, I walked down to sub-basement 3, my boots echoing in the quiet building. The pump room was bone dry. The air smelled of normal grease and cold iron. I walked over to the manual level indicator on the concrete cistern wall. The orange float sat dead at the bottom of the tube, 0 feet. But when I looked down at the concrete floor right next to the inspection manhole, my breath caught. Sitting on the dry limestone dust was a single perfect piece of old copper hardware. A heavy threaded wing nut from the 1950s era deep-sea diving helmet. It was covered in fresh, wet green algae, and a small pool of dark blackish river water was slowly spreading out from beneath it. I left my keys on the pump room table. I didn't sign the logs. I walked out of the building, climbed into my truck, and drove out of the county before noon. The Grandview Recreation Center was demolished 4 months later. I watched the local news coverage on a television in a diner 2 counties away. The reporter stood in front of the rubble, mentioning that the demolition crew had been delayed by several weeks because they kept finding unexplained water accumulation in the subterranean foundations, despite the water mains having been cut at the highway months prior. I work in residential heating now. No commercial pools, no municipal systems, no sub-basements. I stay on the ground floor, where the air is dry and the pipes are small. But every winter when the humidity drops and the old cast iron radiators in my house begin to heat up, they set out a series of sharp metallic knocks as the steam rises through the lines. And if I sit long enough in the dark room, listening to the pipes expand, I can hear the faint, wet echo of water moving behind the drywall, the slow, rhythmic sloshing of a well that never truly empties, waiting for the valves to turn.